the kind of like data-centric digital side in the morning, and now we're talking about the physical side of things, and the concept of looking at the timeline, right? Starting, Matt, you were talking about like 5 years ago, you were just a pad of dirt in the ground, and build this kind of shell of building, and now you're talking about millions of square footage of facade, and Justin, you're talking about this kind of timeline of sheet metal and fabrication, and whether it's additive or subtractive or forming and so on. With that kind of looking back in time and kind of really being digesting that and where we are today in terms of the concept of making for building scale and manufacturing scale, like, do you see kind of like a trend where we should be looking towards?
Sure, I guess I'll take that first. Yeah, I mean, there's a number of new technologies that are coming into play right now in additive, subtractive, forming, et cetera. But I think, the methods that have been sort of enabled by other industries aren't necessarily a good fit for the construction industry. Just because we 3D print plastic, and extrude it and build up something sort of bit by bit or atom by atom, that doesn't necessarily scale well to the building world. So I think this next decade or so, we'll see a lot of new technologies in that space about, how we go from CAD to directly to a part, but using different methodologies. In the aerospace world, they've totally changed their manufacturing process there, and they've gone from, they would cast a lot of parts, and the casting in this country and even around the world has gotten very difficult to quality control and things like that. Because of computation, they've gone from, so instead of trying to cast a thing in a formwork, they go to a solid chunk of aluminum and remove 98% of it and recycle that bit. All because computational technology, the speed of the machines, the speed of the software, the ease of use of creating parts that way, it's changed the math for them. And I think we're going to see a lot of that in construction world as well.
Yeah, I think one of the trends that I've kind of seen is making things is a lot more complicated than you would ever imagine if you're not on that sort of side of the table. A lot of the buildings even some of the buildings that I showed probably don't look that complicated that they would warrant, 10 or 20,000 models being created. And I think a big part of that is just where we are today in sort of architectural and engineering design. It's very easy to make something that seems fairly rational and straightforward quite complicated. And from our perspective as somebody that's doing fabrication and sort of manufacturing, or somewhere kind of in between, the only way to keep up with that is technology. Like sort of to Justin's point, I mean, we use 3D printing for all sorts of things other than 3D printing objects that go on the building. We use it for jigs and fixtures and tips for sealant and running things down the line, but that level of sort of advanced manufacturing hasn't yet made its way into the products that we're putting onto buildings.
So a lot of us spend our time kind of in this digital world. We spend a lot of time modeling, and from the BIM side of things to the parametric side of things to doing a lot of scheduling, whether it's staffing or project phasing or anything like that. And a lot of it is like digitally focused to potentially build this building in the future, right? Assuming the client doesn't kind of pull the rug out from under you. What are some of the things that as designers we don't necessarily take into account that we should, that going from the digital realm to the physical realm, what are we missing something in our designs that we should be taking into account?
Having been on both sides of the digital and the manufacturing side, I guess, yes, probably a lot. But I think it's key to engage with people that are making stuff very early on in your process, because that can help sort of the process throughout the whole, from start to end. And it's not to say to influence the design overall or anything, but really just to engage, what do you guys need to deliver for that thing to be made? That might change, like, all these digital processes that you're doing, because there's the slide of, you know, the wasted grasshopper file that's in the trash. I think you guys had that one, and that, like, there's so much of that happens, and there might be some awesome data in there that the manufacturers can use that's just buried off away. There's also maybe a lot of that was wasted in making it for something that'll never be used. So I think engaging with the people that are making very early on is always key.
Yeah, I think I could reiterate that like 1,000 times over. I mean,
On every project.
The things that you may think are relevant or important may not be a driver at all for the person that's going to make or fabricate or install or build that building or that project. And the things that you kind of push off to the side may be the driver. So having that discussion, that conversation early, usually results in probably the best possible outcome for everybody. You know, that keeps you from having that moment with the owner that says, well, yeah, we're not going to pay for that, right? Because the sooner you can get to having those discussions about what is feasible, what isn't feasible, what's the cost, what's the timeline, the better, you know. And I think every project, every building is going to have its own set of unique challenges. So, you know, trying to reach out to the right people at the right time.
I think both of you are kind of touching on this topic of change, right? Like, Justin, you're looking at kind of like a really broad timeline of, you know, the old school metal stamping machine to kind of this concept of ubiquity, and Matt, you're looking at this kind of this concept of change, you know, internally focused, right? But you're also taking some, you know, industry standard things like those dollies and saying, well, we don't need those, we can make those different, right? Everyone says that change is good, but in the end, we're humans and we're creatures of habit, right? And we like habit. And the minute you kind of disrupt someone's habit, you know, then there's like, oh, well, why do I need to do this differently? Like, it's always been working, right? Like, how do you, as a culture, as injecting yourself into an industry, how do you kind of positively put a spin on breaking someone's habit and influencing change?
I mean, one of the things that we do is, you know, we have teams, so we have departments within the company, right? You have design, you have engineering, you have manufacturing, you have procurement, right? But we sort of force everybody to sit in a room together and talk about, you know, overall company processes. So you can start to better understand the person kind of in front or behind you. And those discussions usually get people to kind of flip a switch or see that light bulb that they maybe didn't see that would have kept them in their own ways when they start to understand more and more of the process. So one of the things that we recently implemented was sort of a company-wide process map. And it'll probably take us about 1.5 years to make this map that literally details every single thing that happens within our business. But it's a team of 30 people, you know? And it's not a team of 30 people because there's bloat in the room and we just need to fill it up with people in chairs, but it's 30 people because these are people that, you know, lead departments, lead teams, and if they understand what's happening before them, if they understand what's happening after them, they're more inclined to say okay when somebody wants to make a change that's going to affect their workflow. So.
Yeah, I would say if you're working on any technology that can change something, make it more efficient, make it easier, make someone's job easier, get it in front of the people that are writing the checks, because that efficiency can, if it can save a lot of money and a lot of time for people and a lot of labor, that's really how it'll kind of work its way into whatever the process is. But I think the important thing is to get it in front of the people that it's going to affect them the most. And that's not always the easiest thing to find those people, but, you know, like some of the IoT stuff, getting it to people like that it's going to affect them on a day-to-day basis and help them help their business, help their customers, et cetera. I think getting that new tech out there in front of those people, that they're more ready to adopt it than not. There's always a couple naysayers, but I think as you put it out there, it's people get excited about new technology in their own realm.
Yeah, and I'd even say sometimes it's not even has to be new tech. I mean, one of the things that we do on a weekly basis is we walk around the factory floor and we try to identify problem areas, right? And we don't necessarily call them problem areas, but opportunities to improve. And it may be as simple as creating like a cart that lives beside the assembly line that has a certain spot for every tool, or removing all the cluster and junk from somebody's workstation. And as you start to do that, and more people become part of those exercises, you start to develop this culture that you can change the way you work, or you can change the place in which, you know, you go and stand for 8 hours, or the desk that you sit at for, you know, 8 hours. But it has to be repetitive, and it has to be done in a sort of welcoming way. And I think one of the things that was really successful for us to develop this culture was starting low. You know, not trying to come in from the top and say, here's this new platform, here's this new thing that's going to change everything about your existence in the building, but starting with small things. So whether it was a small thing in, you know, a modeling process to automate something, or a small thing on the factory line, but having lots of little moments like that allows you to continue to make bigger steps and bigger strides as you go.
What are some of the differences you would say between the concepts of prototyping and manufacturing?
Yeah, I think, yeah, as you go from, I mean, there's a lot of parallels that follow through, especially when you're working on making something. Like, if you're kind of on both sides of it, and you're, you know, the manufacturing world is very different from architecture. I was trying to explain the architectural process to someone from aerospace, and I think his head was going to spin off his neck, because just all the different players all over the place. Whereas their thing is, they have subcontractors and things, but they're much more well contained, you know, between design, manufacture, et cetera, that whole process. So you're always thinking about how you're going to make it as you're designing it, or at least it's a little more directly connected. So I think, again, like in the architecture world, step over the aisle and engage with the people that are making the stuff to really link that together better, because you don't know what might make their job easier, or the information that they might want that you can get to them easier.
Yeah, I'd say cost is a big part of it too.
Yeah.
You know, making the leap from sort of prototyping and fabrication to quote unquote manufacturing, right? You're thinking about scalability, and cost is usually right there in that line. So how can you grow something from that prototype into something that's affordable, or meets a budget, or meets a scheduled cost? And that's a challenge that, you know, we see with a lot of the sort of new technology is, how do you bridge that gap from kind of everything is unique, or it's a one-off, or it's sort of rapid prototype, to more traditional manufacturing methods that do have that lower cost? And then finding that balance in between when something doesn't necessarily warrant traditional manufacturing, and, you know, you can go to more of a prototyped or advanced manufacturing sort of solution.
I'd say, just to add to that, you know, there's atoms are much more expensive than bits. So, like, when you're replicating things in software, the person that has to do that on the hardware side, and again, like going back and forth between both of those worlds, it's much more difficult on the hardware side to make multiple of things versus copy and paste in your computer software. And shifting into that world and figuring out how to replicate things quickly and fast, and automating and everything, there's a lot more heavy lifting that has to happen on that side of the table, for sure.
Cool. We're going to open it up to some questions in the audience.
This is a question for Matt. How open are you for taking in data from engineers and architects, and how do you handle the risk associated with that?
Yeah, I'd say more often than not, we'll take whatever data anybody's willing to give us. But since we own a significant amount of risk in this process, it usually involves us going back and trying to recreate it to make sure it actually works. So yes, it's great as a sort of coordination, collaboration piece to make sure we're on the same page, but more often than not, we're not taking, say, you know, a spreadsheet of data points or fabrication models and running with them directly. We're sort of going through and re-engineering it to make sure it works within the constraints that, you know, we're ultimately responsible for.
There's one further up. There's one further up.
You mentioned at some point, and I couldn't agree more, that us as engineers and architects and BIM managers should start thinking about making when we start designing and engaging with people that make things in the very start of the process. What about the other way around? So do you have, like, as manufacturing companies, any sort of strategy of training people, let's say in the very final stage of building, like on-site, builders on-site, and getting them introduced to new tools, these digital tools or AR and VR, in order to, let's say, meet somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, I'd say the last couple months I've been pretty heavy on that, because putting sort of a new type of tool out there, you have to engage with the customers, you know, that are ultimately going to be sort of specifying and using and asking you to make parts for them. So listen, like from the sort of manufacturing side of it, asking the customers as well to sort of specify that, like what they want, what they need, where they see their work going. It's very important for manufacturers to do that, I think, for curtain wall or anybody on the manufacturing side. I don't think it happens enough. I think there's sort of these processes that exist that they're malleable, but there's, again, not that engagement the other way. So for certain, happy to discuss with anybody that has ideas about new ways to look at implementing these kind of technologies.
We have one up front. Hudson, we have one up front.
I mean, obviously, I know you guys pretty well, but it would be good if you guys gave a little bit of your background of basically how you professionally got to this point.
Oh,
I mean, I hired Justin because he built a carbon fiber bicycle in college, and Matt because he was an expert modeler and already had, you know, manufacturing and facade consulting experience. So many people are in that same sort of realm right now, so it'd be good to hear that.
Sure, I'll take that first. Yeah, I guess like a lot of people in the room, I'm also a recovering architect, and you know, even back when I started in architecture school many years ago, it was really all about making, like that. At least my schooling, you know, I had to lay bricks with Chicago Union bricklayers, which sounds like it happened 100 years ago, but it really didn't. But I think sort of taking that interest in making the whole way and going from sort of design to engineering and then all the way into fabrication, that's kind of been that general path. I've always been interested in the connection between, you know, the design and the making, but I think just in this last, I mean, I'll say even couple years, it's amazing how many new tools are out there that allow us to change how we're building and fabricating, and not just in the architectural world, in everything. I mean, I mean, there's a lot of stuff around, you know, Industry 4.0 and all these silly terms, but it's really, we're really right at the start of how we're going to change making stuff.
Yeah, I was like almost, you know, similar story. I mean, recovering architect, which is a tough place to be in a curtain wall company that generally don't like architects that much. But you know, I worked with the guys here at Core Studio for about 3.5, 4 years before joining New Hudson, and this is kind of my first foray into manufacturing. You know, I'd spent time doing fabrication, you know, I'm a tinkerer, a builder, a maker, but manufacturing is a totally different beast. Just, you know, the amount of information, the complexity of supply chain management, and having to think about all those things while you're doing design and engineering is a new challenge. And for me, that's, you know, that's what's kind of exciting about it is we're at a place today, you know, we kind of sit down and look at these projects with some of the old timers in the office, and they're like, well, you know, back when I had to, you know, draw all these parts by hand on a drafting board, and, you know, now we're talking 30,000, you know, models get made for a project. So a lot's evolved in probably the last 15 to 20 years in this specific industry, and I'm just sort of latching on in the last, you know, 4 or 5 years with them. But I think that's one of the interesting things about having a conversation and sort of crossing over disciplines is I can help sort of a company like that understand where it's all coming from, which I think has been beneficial to keep us up to speed and, you know, staying on pace with the types of projects that we're chasing.
Any other folks? So I guess we shouldn't have, for Lunch and Learn, sales reps trying to sell us faucets and rugs. Is that the idea? To engage early with manufacturers. With that being said, thank you guys.
Thanks.